now we're in a somewhat of a stage, if you will, in utilities overall. We'll talk about that. We'll, of course, provide you some background on our recommendations and methodology we used. But before I get into the meat of the presentation, I want to draw your attention to the quote at the bottom of the screen. "When the well is dry, we learn the worth of water," Benjamin Franklin. I love this quote. I use it almost every presentation I give these days because I feel like it's so indicative of what we see in the water utility industry. Right now, that beautiful lake in your background is full. Last time we were here, not so much. We're seeing that happen across the nation where we're facing water availability issues, where literally those wells are running dry or the lakes are running dry. But we're also seeing it figuratively. And by that, I mean what the American Water Works Association calls as an infrastructure crisis. Essentially, what we're seeing across the nation are utilities that put their infrastructure in the ground 30, 40, 50 years ago in some instances. That infrastructure's long been paid off. Utility rates aren't funding the cost of the original installation of that infrastructure. And now it has to be rehabilitated and or replaced, and that comes at a cost. And what's happening is utilities customers are just not used to paying for that infrastructure. A lot of that infrastructure was actually put in with utility block grant funding or developer funding, and those rates just don't pay for that right now. And we're having to adjust our rates as we have to make improvements to our infrastructure. Couple that with growth, which Mayor and I were just talking about. This community is growing quite rapidly. And we have another challenge because to keep up with growth, which is oftentimes linear, we have to install infrastructure in a block pattern, in stepped fashion. So we have to install it before we have people here to pay for it. So we have to balance those needs in the utility. As Mr. Franklin claims here or alludes to, learning the worth of water. I make the argument that overall, our society has come to undervalue water. We see symptoms in our inherent undervaluation of water in our day-to-day lives when we turn on the faucet and let water go straight down the drain while we wait for the shower to heat up every morning, or while we're brushing our teeth, et cetera, et cetera. We also see it when we just pour it on the ground to keep that grass beautiful and green. What we're having to do, though, is learn what that worth of water is now. I provided for you here what I call the economic reality of water. At the top of this rung, if you will, we see that water has an inherent value. It's the value that most people see if we structure our utility rates correctly. It's a check we write to the water utility every month, and that should fund the cost of operating and the cost of that infrastructure we just talked about. We also see, though, there's some other intangible values to water. The first is it's a critical building block of our community. It's also critical to our economy. This community cannot grow if you didn't have that water reserved and those water rights coming out of that lake. Equally, and probably one of the most important points, is that water is, quite frankly, the only commodity we cannot live without. Take a minute, step back and think about that. We literally physically cannot survive without water, yet we have a little bit of an interesting dichotomy. We have a commodity that's so valuable and important. It's important to our community, to our economy, and to our lives, yet we undervalue it to the point we literally pour it down the drain. As we're facing this infrastructure crisis, we're having to learn that worth of water. And unfortunately, we're in a position where we have to shift that dichotomy a little bit, work on public education, and just understanding how critical and important this utility is that you all have and manage. I give this to you as a little bit of an overall broad background of what we're seeing in the industry to let you know that what you're facing and looking at your utility rates is common industry-wide. It's something that each of you are facing, but your neighbors are facing as well as utilities across the country. In looking at your utility rates, we usually take a four-step approach. The first step is to determine revenue requirements. Then we go into some funky terms that the water industry uses, like functionalization, and we'll talk about that term in just a moment. We allocate cost to classes of customers, and we design the rates. And I'd like to walk you through those steps in a little bit more detail, starting with revenue requirements. Revenue requirements, simply put, are the revenues your utility rate structure needs to recover to meet your needs. When we start looking at revenue requirements, we look at it a little backwards from a budget. We instead start with our expenses first rather than our revenues. We identify those expenditures, and then we back out things that we call revenue offsets, things like late fees and penalties, things like that. That being said, we did use your 2020 budget as a starting point. We compared that budget to historical actual performances to get a feel for whether or not that budget accurately or reasonably represented your expenditures. And then we looked at basically a 5-year plan. In developing those revenue requirements, not only do we look at your operating expenditures, but we also look at annual debt service on the utility. We use a process called the cash needs basis that the American Water Works Association has defined. And what the cash needs basis tells us is that we're looking at your cash requirements for the utility. So we're not looking at any sort of depreciation expense. That's a non-cash expenditure. We're also not looking at any sort of return on investment or profit. This is a break-even cash analysis for this utility. That's important for your residents to know. The city's not looking to make a buck off of this. This is just to recover the cost of operating the system. In looking at your debt, we did look at 2 different pieces of debt. And this is an important element to understand. The first piece of your debt service we looked at is your existing debt. We went through and analyzed what debt you had on the system and essentially the debt for the city, because many of your debt issuances are partially for water utilities and partially for streets or other generally funded projects. Once we did that, we identified the city has just under $2.2 million in annual debt service requirements related to the water and wastewater utility system. Currently, under current policy, you're only paying for $1.5 million of that debt out of your utility rates. The remaining $700,000 is being funded out of the general fund. So that means your residents, part of their property taxes, are actually paying for the water utility. This is a policy directive on behalf of the city. However, industry best management practice is to have your utility rates fund the full cost of providing that service. The reason why we make that recommendation is because, quite frankly, property values are very rarely indicative of the burden individual customers are going to put on the system. I'll give myself and my neighbor as an example. We live in a house which, oddly coincidentally, we bought not knowing that it was the prior general manager of the utility that we live within, and we have 0 landscaping, not a bit. We don't irrigate at all. Our average family usage is about 4,000 to 5,000 gallons of water a month. We don't put a drop of water on the ground. Our neighbor has a beautiful green lawn. It is gorgeous. But his usage is around 15,000 to 20,000 gallons a month in the summer, lower than that in the winter, but still higher than our family uses because he still irrigates. So if our property taxes are paying for that utility debt, quite frankly, my family's subsidizing his family. The other issue for the city of Lago Vista to understand and consider is with regard to wastewater. You do have some outside city customers over in Johnstown that you provide wastewater service to who are not paying property taxes to the city. So if your utility rates aren't paying the whole cost of providing utility services, in essence, could be argued the city of Lago Vista customers, through their property taxes, are subsidizing these other customers. Because of that, we have developed a 5-year transitional plan, and in fact, you've already started that plan back last time we did this study. Last time we did this study, you were only paying about $1 million a year in debt out of your utility rates. Now you're paying about $1.5 million. The transitional plan we've adapted or developed for you is so that you can get to paying the full $2.2 million by the end of a 5-year period of time, by taking on essentially an extra $250,000 each year to get you to the full cost of service. That gets to the second element, which is future debt service. We did identify when we looked at some of your capital projects that the city does have some future capital needs on your utility system. For the water system, you have a 5-year capital improvement plan of about $10.5 million. And working with your staff, it appears that about $2.35 million of that will need to be funded through water rates. We're recommending funding that with debt and then paying that debt with your water rates through the transitional plan. On the wastewater side, you've got about $11.2 million in future capital project needs on your wastewater utility in the next 5 years, and about $5.9 million, just shy of $5.6 million of that, will need to be funded through utility rates. We've built that into the plan so that in the end of 5 years, you would recover through the rates we'll talk about here shortly. You'll recover that new debt in its entirety plus all of the existing debt in its entirety through utility rates. By doing this and taking small bites at a time, not only are you putting in place utility rates that are equitable and fair, asking customers to pay for what they receive, but also, quite frankly, you're alleviating about $700,000 in burden off of your general fund. That would obviously be to your policy of how you wanted to address that on the general fund side in terms of adjustments to taxes or funding for other programs, et cetera, but it certainly would take some burden off of that. That being said, we do have a 5-year outlook that we've developed for the city's rates, going from just under $6 million revenue requirement in 2020 to just shy or just over $7.7 million by 2024. That increase, there is some inflation assumptions that we have put into place, but the majority of that increase is taking on this additional debt for your existing debt plus new debt on the system. For benchmarking purposes, I did put in there your 2018 estimated revenues from your water and wastewater rates at about $5.3 million. The next step in the process is when we get to this great word that the AWWA keeps telling me is a real word, and Webster's Dictionary and spell check on my computer is convinced it's not, which is functionalization. To understand cost functionalization, first we have to understand how a water utility is built. Essentially, your water utility is built for peak times with a lot of extra capacity to meet those peak times of demand. To understand what peak demand is, extra capacity, I want to give you a real-world example, which is a restaurant. If you go to your local restaurant, popular place, good restaurant, at 7 o'clock on a Friday night, it's probably packed. You may even have to wait for a table. When you go to that same restaurant at 2 o'clock on the Tuesday, no one's there. If I were to average the number of customers that restaurant serves over a 24-hour period, I'm probably going to find that number is significantly lower than the number of tables that restaurant has. And the reason? Restaurant was built for times of peak demand, and it has extra capacity to allow it to meet those times of peak demand. Water utility is built the same way. Our water utility by law has to be built with all of this extra capacity to handle these times of peak demand. It's built for July in Central Texas when everybody waters their lawn, runs their dishwasher, their washing machine, all at the same time. That's what we are building these systems for, is to handle that one peak day out of the entire year. We have to have that capacity. In our restaurant example, there's a cost to that. We have to build a bigger restaurant, so we have to have a bigger lot and a bigger parking lot and more square footage. We have to heat and cool more square footage, more equipment, et cetera, et cetera. Likewise, the same circumstance happens to our water utility. We have costs associated with maintaining this extra capacity of peak demand. So the American Water Works Association outlines a methodology called the Base Extra Capacity Methodology, which essentially tells us, breaks costs into three categories. The first cost category is base cost of service. This is the cost of meeting average daily demands on the system. If we got to live in a bubble world and we didn't have to meet these peaking demands, this is the theoretical cost that we would have on the system. The second category, or extra capacity cost of service, this is the cost of what it's costing us to meet these peaking demands on the system. And the third category are customer costs. These are the costs of reading meters, billing customers, customer service representatives, etc. Once we have these three categories, we then have to recognize that customers use water very differently. Here I have an example of a customer in the light blue. If I charted their use every month, we see very little deviation in their actual demands. By contrast, you'll see customer Y, where they have a big peak in their demand. Again, going back to a personal example, before I bought my house over in Lakeway, where I don't have any landscaping, I lived in Austin and I had a big, beautiful green lawn. And in the winter months, my family used about 4,000 gallons of water a month. And in the summer, our use went up to 15,000 to 20,000 gallons of water in a month. That meant that the City of Austin Water Utility had to maintain the capacity. They had to have the water rights from LCRA, and they had to have all of the system capacities, the treatment plant, the distribution system, all of that in play to provide my family with 20,000 gallons of water a month, even though I only use that a couple months out of the whole year. What we do and why we're looking at this is because we have to recognize customers are different. The cost of service methodology described by the American Water Works Association allows us to evaluate customers and understand their peaking demands on the system. Base costs of service are allocated to customers looking at their average daily demands. Extra capacity costs of service are allocated to customer classes based off of their relative peaking on the system, or the extra capacity demand they're putting on the system. And customer class costs of service are just looking at the number of customers. Doesn't matter how much water you use, I send you one bill a month, I read your meter once a month, and I have to have somebody there to collect your money once a month. Once we've done this, we then start to look at rate design. We try to recover the cost of providing service to customer classes based upon their unique and individual demands on the system. We do, though, work to package that in terms of base fee and volumetric fee to mitigate the financial impacts on the system, to be fair to customers, and quite frankly, to try to meet your goals and some affordability with customers. That being said, we work with your staff to provide a rate design for your consideration, starting with the base fee for the water utility. In looking at your charges on the water side, we are recommending leaving the base fee the same for 3 years and then making about a $2 to $3 a month adjustment to the base fee after the first 3-year period. The advantage of doing this is, quite frankly, customers have a little bit more control. The remaining increases in rates are on the volumetric side. That means customers have 100% control over what rate increases due to them just by how often and what they do when they turn on and off that faucet. Beyond 2022, we do recommend some slight increases because that's when some of those additional capital projects need to be funded. So we are recommending increasing the base fee at that point. The goal there is to allow you to fund your debt through the base charge because we want to give you that revenue stability to make your payments. Because if we start selling less water or water demands change based on weather, we'd like to see your revenue stable. On the volumetric side, again, we're recommending charging rates based off of customer class, recognizing the different demands that your various customer classes place on the system. We're trying to, again, recognize that different burden. We are, though, recommending a tiered rate structure. A tiered rate structure, and we'll go through that exact structure in just a moment, essentially increases the volumetric rates based upon consumption. The reason for this is because even within a customer class, individual customers like myself and my neighbor still use water differently. Tiered rates help to shift some of that cost burden and recognize those differences. It's also a conservation rate. It encourages customers to use water efficiently. That being said, let's start looking at those rates, starting with the commercial customers. Every year for the 5-year period, we are recommending leaving the 0 to 2,000 gallon rate the same for commercial customers. And then you can see the tiered rates beyond the 0 to 2,000 gallon ratio outlined on the table. The goal was to leave that first tier relatively the same, again, allowing those smaller businesses a little bit more control and then being more aggressive on the conservation tier side. Going next to irrigation rates, this is the area where you're going to see the biggest difference. These are for irrigation customers that have a separate meter for irrigation purposes. These meters, when we looked at them, quite frankly, they have the most peaking on the system. They're using a lot more water and demands on the system. So we're recommending going ahead and increasing the tiered rates across the board starting in 2020. Again, this is completely based on their unique cost of service. On the residential side, we're recommending going from the current tier of $5.04 for the 2 to 5,000 gallon rate to $5.25. So just about 21-cent increase in that rate. And then you can see the increase is slightly thereafter. The first year is only 21 cents a 1,000 gallons. The 0 to 2,000 gallon rate, though, we do include and have included 2,000 gallons of use in your base fee.
On this one, Alyssa, on the handout,
Yes.
the top 4 rows of numbers are in some other language.
Okay. Well, I apologize for that. I don't know.
You're good.
That, I love Microsoft. I say facetiously. You could also see the table change because they updated my software in between here. So in terms of the format, it did something strange. So we'll get you the
I'll pull up the
handout.
email, Alyssa, and I'll send it to council.
That would be
right
great.
now.
Yeah, can I ask a question, or do you want to go all the way through, Mayor?
I'm fine with asking a question. Yes, sir.
Back to the volumetric change, the irrigation volumetric fees, how do you know somebody's irrigating?
The customers have the ability to get a separate meter for irrigation purposes, and it's coded in your billing system as an irrigation meter. Usually these are customers who, quite frankly, would rather pay the irrigation rate than pay water and sewer off of their usage. The majority of those customers are actually commercial customers that have a separate irrigation meter. And so the customer tells you.
I guess the question is, how are we going to tell for residential folks if they're using if they have a,
Unless
Great
they have
question.
a separate meter, you cannot tell.
Yes.
and so you've got to get a separate meter in order to use the irrigation rate.
That's correct.
Otherwise,
Yes.
you're just
Other-
paying the standard rate.
Yes,
Correct.
yes, sir.
Okay.
And so the
Or-
majority of the customers are going to be commercial, and they'll have a domestic meter which serves the rest of their building. The majority of customers in this category, they'll have a domestic meter that serves the interior of their building that also pays sewage, and then they'll have a separate irrigation meter. On the residential side, residential customers, this is the table for their rates, and they would have a separate rate structure. Most of the time, residential customers find it cost prohibitive to pay a separate impact fee and tap fee and base fee and all of that to have a separate irrigation meter. Most of the time, residential customers will just have a single residential rate. We do something a little differently on their sewer for residential customers than we do the commercial, and we'll get to that in a minute because that's where the big difference is. Because of that, though, that's why residential customers do have their separate tier. Residential customers, your current policy includes 2,000 gallons of use in the base rate, and we're recommending continuing that. Again, what that does is provides customers with a little bit of consumption. My family is a family of 4, and as I mentioned before, we use between 4,000 and 5,000 gallons, and none of that goes outside. So by giving 2,000 gallons of use, you're giving some basic needs, if you will, in the base charge. And then beyond that, we've increased the rate slightly by about 21 cents in the first year. And then you can see the increases thereafter that we're recommending.
Yeah, the
If I-
chart,
if
the
I may.
chart that we can't read is page 17 of the basics.
Yes.
And so that, if you have your email, if it did pull it up, it's on that email, and then just click that, and you'll see that page.
And Frank, to add on, if I may, so your residential customers, if they, for whatever reason, don't have a separate meter for their irrigation, they will pay a sewage wastewater rate on any water that they use for irrigation. So the residential customer has to weigh out the cost of the wastewater or get a separate meter.
Correct. And you do have a few residential customers that have chosen to do this. They're usually larger lot owners, et cetera.
My understanding is the wastewater rates are based on what your water usage is in the winter.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. Exactly. So what we're recommending on the wastewater side is slight increases in the base fee, going from $17.22 to $19 in 2020, and then around figures $3 a month increase each year thereafter to get you to, by 2024, fully recovering your cost. The biggest impact to your wastewater rates is that $6 million in future CIP projects that we've got outstanding that need to be funded through your wastewater rates. On the residential side, we're recommending leaving the volumetric rate the same. So just that base fee increase of the $3 a month. On the commercial side, we're recommending a slight increase in 2022. And this is based off of the deviation between the actual demands on the system that we're projecting by that year. Whoop, something just went awry. Sorry about that. All right, we'll go back here. I've given you some examples. One of the things we've talked about, the base fee, the volumetric fee, tiered rates. It's easier to, I think most people are more concerned about, well, what's the check I'm going to have to write to the city at the end of the month? Average usage somewhere in the 7,000 gallon range to give you some perspective if we looked at an annual average. Usually what we see is in the summer months, customers, residential customers, to be more specific, are in the 10, 15,000 gallon range if they have a lot of irrigating going on, and then they're much lower in the winter months. You can see here for an average customer using 10,000 gallons, they would end up paying the city just over $1, almost $1.60 something additional a month. So it's a pretty minor increase for the first year. The second year, we are seeing a slightly greater increase, and then you see around a $3 to $4 increase thereafter in the total bill to customers for 10,000 gallons. If we look on the 5,000 gallon rate of 5,000 gallons of usage, you'll see much slower increases in the increases in the bill a customer would pay, again, because we tried to keep those lower tiered rates as stable as we could. On the wastewater side, you are going to see a customer, and about 5,000 gallons is what, again, a fourth-person household typically uses for indoor domestic use. You'll see their bill go from $70.97 to $72.75, and then about $3 each year thereafter. Trying to keep, again, as the increases total in the $5 to $7 range per household per month for when we look at both water and wastewater. Again, part of the goal we were looking at here was to allow customers to have maximum control over what these rates would do to their monthly bills. In terms of recommendations, we do recommend the city proceed with this transitional implementation plan, allowing you to get there. I have to emphasize one of the biggest things with this transitional implementation plan is you're not there yet. So if you implement the first year, the second year, and the third year rates, and then all of a sudden your growth grows crazy and we miss the growth a little bit, that's okay because we're still not fully funding that debt yet. By going ahead and proceeding with this, look at it and benchmark where you are with where we projected you'd be. And your staff can do that. They have a nice thick booklet of work papers and always know how to find me. That can allow them to identify where they are and where they would recommend you go. And we do recommend doing that every year as part of your budgeting process to make sure that the projections that we put forward are still reasonable and make sense. We recommend updating 3 to 5 years. Typically, 5 years will do great, assuming things are tracking along fairly closely. But if we veer off the path too much, we recommend coming back and looking at it again. I know I've given you a lot of information, and I've been compared to trying to take a drink out of a fire hose. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Yes, sir.
Your page with the average bill analysis,
Yes.
when you get down to 50,000 gallon, you go from 2020 to 2021. You actually decrease the rate on here?
And you know what? That is, we had a last minute change there, and I bet that's a mistake. So yes, it should stay the same. Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, I was thinking it should be something maybe
Yes.
like 588.
You're absolutely right.
570.
You're absolutely right, and we'll get you that correction there.
A similar question to what Councilman Weatherly had. When you look at those rates, they're based on usage, obviously. At what point does the rate change? Because I see a major change, the one that you're pointing to, where you're comparing what one pays for 5,000 gallons and then a different rate for 10,000 gallons. So does that mean if you use 5,001, that you're now paying the 10,000?
That's a great question. Yes, it's kind of like taxes. So you pay for your first 2,000 to 5,000 gallons, those 3 units, we pay at the rate in that tier, the next tier. So you go through the
So
tiers.
it's an up to?
Yes, it's an up to,
Got it.
and you go through them. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have an update question. Indicating, this really has to do with the idea that these are 5-year CIP, that's what we're planning on selling bonds for. How do we plug in what we actually did without having to go back and visiting again
Sure.
every 3 to 5 years with a consultant? It's actually 2 questions.
Great question.
In other words, one, how do we plug in what we actually spent? And 2, do we need to say hi to you again to turn on your magic set of algorithms in order to find out what we're supposed to do now?
Sure. So the first question is, your staff works pretty hard to shake that magic ball and crystal ball and do the best they can to make reasonable projections. Those projections are, one, the timing of when you need projects. Any projects that are growth related could change at the drop of a hat. And 2, the price of the project, how much it's going to cost. They use the best estimates available at the time of projections made. Those are plugged in, and equally your finance staff goes through and says, okay, we're going to be able to fund X amount with impact fees and X amount we have in fund balance, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some projections that go into it. As part of the process and part of what takes some time is to shake that crystal ball as much as we can. So what you're seeing today are based off of the best estimates available. And also, though, of course, comes to you all in your decisions and your policies. So if you vote not to fund the debt, then it's not going to get funded. And so there are, of course, those assumptions. If that situation were to come and we're veered off further, either your staff, you as a council can say, hey, we don't want to proceed with next year's increase as an example. Or B, your staff can run numbers internally and say, we think it should be X. Or C, your staff could come to you and say, hey, we think we need to come in and do an update. I keep all of these models and have them so we can plug in and go, okay, if all we're changing in this model is we're moving debt, we thought we were going to fund X and now we're funding Y, we can plug that in and very quickly and give that answer back to your staff without doing the whole thing.
Thank you. Another question. We were supposed to get an out-of-city rate from this. Have we got that? Y'all know the deal I'm talking about.
There was something on the 35 page.
Yeah, we discussed it, but I don't know if we've actually developed the out-of-city rate. I don't think we've,
Sewer is 20% more.
Yes.
yeah.
It's just an algorithm off of the inside city rates. You charge 20% more than inside.
Thanks.
Sure.
Okay. So then actually, Jonestown people are paying 20% more. So that kind
Correct.
of offsets the property tax.
It offsets part of it, but you also have to realize that you're taking it further and there's some other operating costs to get it to you. Yes.
Well, maybe I misunderstood the answer. Are you recommending that the out-of-city rate be 20% more?
Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yes, yes.
That's what I thought.
And in fact, the Jonestown rates are actually by contract.
Yeah.
The contract specifies a percentage over the inside city rates.
So over the next 5 years, percentage-wise, what kind of growth does this equal to?
So it depends on, of course, the customer and how much water they're using. In 5 years of 5,000 gallon customers going up $10 roughly, 20% in 5 years. That, of course, is keeping in pace with inflation plus additional debt.
Mayor, one of the challenges that we've seen is something that was brought to the council before was theoretically, we think that additional utility accounts should result in an overall reduction in utility rates. It sounds great in theory, but as we've said over and over again, apparently as users, we are all incredibly conservative and water-minded so that we are reducing our use. And so if we look at the last 5 years, we're showing that our individual uses and our community use is going down, henceforth the revenue streams going down. And so what should see as a benefit or a struggle with growth doesn't necessarily mean that we get to reduce water and wastewater
Correct.
rates. And that's a crazy anomaly.
Exactly. It's counterintuitive, unfortunately. You have two pieces. The first piece is water utilities are largely fixed costs. The only thing that are variable are your chemicals, your electricity, and part of your water rates, and actually you all have a great deal with LCRA, is the raw water piece. But everything else is fixed. That debt, your lenders really don't care how much it rains or how much water you use. It's all fixed. Because of that, because use goes down and most of your cost stays the same, it's just algebra. Now we have fewer units to separate it out to. The other anomaly with growth is when we have to add this additional capacity. As I talked about, we add capacity in blocks and we grow this way, and we're having to build it and stay ahead of that growth. You do have impact fees, and that's great, but you're not collecting the 100% from the impact fee, the balance. That other 50% of that capacity infrastructure cost gets put into the utility rates. And so that's, again, balancing all of those needs all at once.
So what's the best way to educate the public our constituents on this
Well,
water rates?
great question. I think that you need to have some information to your constituents, but I would focus on the impact to the bill. If I told a customer, hey, your water rates are going up by 5% next year, first thing they're going to do is they're going to go get their bill and they're going to think it applies to everything that you may be billing them for, and they're going to take that. And 5% sounds really offensive, but if I tell them, it's less than $1, it's, oh, okay, not a big deal. And so I think that's the key, and the important thing is to talk in terms of dollars, so customers understand, okay, this is $1, and then explain the need. By doing this, you're funding our utility rates through the utility instead of our property taxes, alleviating that burden off of our general fund, and asking customers to pay for what they use, just trying to make it fair to everybody.
To piggyback on what Josh was saying, I was looking this study here. 2016, the city used 478.5 million gallons with a peak of 3.7 for a day. 2 years later, we have dropped to 457.3 million total and a peak demand of 2.0 million. So we've gone from 3.7 to 2.0 in the 2 years as far as our peak demand. So, and we've gone down 21 million total demand. So even with
Several hundred more.
401 additional households or retail customers, we've gone down quite a bit in the amount of water that the
That's
city,
correct.
the customers are using.
That's correct. And in fact, Mary may recall last time we talked about this, what would happen and what hit this whole area, the entirety of Central Texas. As you recall, we were in the middle of a drought, and we just came out of that drought, and we had a lot of discussion of, we don't know. We saw usage go down, 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 and utilities all across Central Texas saw that. As we were in drought conditions, we had mandatory restrictions and all of that coming to play. And the question was, are we going to rebound? Are customers going to go back up in their usage? And in this community, the answer is no, they didn't. What's you're seeing, and we saw this in Austin, was you could see neighborhoods where people are like, well, the grass died. I'm like, why reinstall grass? I'm going to put something in there that's going to use less water. Customer habits actually changed. Oh, I can get away with just watering twice a week. I don't have to water every day. And
Well, we
Can
still
I-
have our water restrictions in
Yeah.
place.
yes.
We
yes,
do. That's correct, Mayor.
Twice a week.
Can I ask a question about where do we measure how much water we're using? Is it measured as a function of what we take out of the lake? Is it measured at the water plants, what the plant puts out? Is it measured?
Mayor, so a couple different questions. So it's measured everywhere. That's the easy answer. The actual production is what we measure daily. So if we're talking about peak production, that's what we're going to measure. So when the mayor says we're at 2.6 million gallons at peak, then it's what we're producing going
so
out.
It's
Going
a
out of the
meter right
plant.
outside the plant.
Yeah, the master
Yes.
meter.
So your water is first metered when it comes out of the lake, and that's actually what LCRA uses to bill you off of. So you're first paid, you pay LCRA out of what comes out of the lake. But when we talk about production, you're measuring it from the plant going out. And then it's also measured at the customer site.
Well, the reason I'm asking is because we've made some major improvements in what we used to have to quote unquote dump. But that's not in this.
Correct. As far as the sludge removal and the processed water, yes, the reductions the mayor's talking about are not in that. That data is available, but that hasn't been presented to you in this report. Yes, sir.
And then when you look at all your customer meters and compare that to what you're metering coming production-wise, that's where you'll find your loss in your system.
Yes. Yes, which is why it gets metered at all locations, is so that you understand what's getting lost between the lake and the intake at the plant, between plant, and, what's being lost in the production process, which is that sludge removal, what's happening in the treatment plant, and then from the plant to the customer sites. Yes. Great. Well, your staff knows where to find me, so.
And on the drought, I don't know if y'all remember, I know a couple of y'all will, but at one point, we actually had to institute an emergency drought fee. $15, I think it was.
Everyone had to do
10,
it.
because
Yes.
we had lost so much revenue.
Yep. And in fact, about everybody around here had to do that. And just to reiterate, that was a perfect example. Everybody had your reduction, your use went down so much, and costs really didn't, so. Well, thank you for your time. We're happy to answer any questions. Well, hi, how are you, sir?
Yes, Ron?
Okay, Ron Smith, 20609 Oak Ridge. Last time we did this, I think was 2015. Was it 2015 or 16? Yeah, and what we had then was a 7-year plan, 7% a year. 4% a year for 7 years, 28%. Okay, total. Are we about the same numbers this time? Okay, so we've gone, 3 years into that plan? And I think 2 years we implemented the 4%, and I think last year, I think we didn't implement it. And so now we're back to the 4% again for 5 years. Also, during that plan, we had a high, medium, and low projection out for CIP projects that would be an add to the rate. And I think we took the middle road. We said there'll be some CIP, but we didn't say it'd be a lot. We didn't say it'd be a little. We kind of said it'd be average. I didn't see those projections in here, and maybe that's because you used the CIP. Did you use the 5-year CIP?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you use those numbers
Yes.
in these, okay? And just for the council's information, back when we were in the drought and we did this study in 15, 16, remember we didn't have water treatment plant 3 in the calculations. So those calculations are now showing up
Correct.
in these rates. We had some to get us going, but not enough to cover the, $11 or $12 million water treatment plant 3. Since that time, we've added another $6 million on the utility side with the 3 big projects that are in there right now. So that's aggravating it even more. And also, you may not be aware of this, but we actually fixed the input side, the revenue side, to twice-a-week watering. And we did that with LCRA, they're aware of it, and we worked with them. By the way, we're the only city on the lake system that has twice-a-week watering year-round. Now, Marble Falls and Burnett wanted to pop some CIP money. So they removed all restrictions 2 or 3 years ago. They removed them all, said, use all the water you can so we can get revenue and buy that stuff. And 6 months later, I asked them, I said, how much money did you make from releasing the restrictions? And the answer was, it stayed the same. They had the behavioral changes gone in across the entire region. So we went through and we locked down twice-a-week watering year-round for Lago Vista. In exchange for doing that, we gave it up on the high end, but we get it back on the low end. So when everybody else goes to once-a-week watering, we're still at twice-a-week watering. What that means is we now have 67% of the variability of the lake that's twice-a-week watering. So by doing that, we now know what the revenue stream is coming into us. We vary it now by the rates. So that's one of the reasons why we did that. We're still the only ones with LCRA with twice-a-week watering, and that's a big deal because, and I've tried to petition, Leander, Cedar Park, all of them to take it to their councils and see if they'll adopt it, but they're kind of afraid to take it to their councils. Not really sure why, but we did, and we really haven't been hurt, I don't think, because you confirmed the numbers have actually gone down. They actually didn't stay the same, they actually went down. So the paradigm shift has taken effect. okay? And that's a good thing, but now we got the back end side of the problem to worry with, which is the rate adjustment that you have to toggle, and there is gonna be a PR problem on the backside, guaranteed. Just like with $2 beer, you're gonna have the same problem with $2 water. You're gonna have the very same issue because it's cheap, and people do take it for granted. They really do, and that's where the paradigm's gonna come in. We pay, what, $5 for milk, for a gallon of milk, and we pay, what, 2 cents for a gallon of water? Something like that, so I think when they figure that out, they'll start to understand, but it looks like our 4% a year for 7 years is now 4% for 5 more years. So the question then becomes, is the council going to raise it 4%? And that's going to be on both water and sewer? Or is that a combination rate? Okay,
We'll look at it.
all right.
Yes. Good.
Kevin Sullivan, 3933 Outpost Trace. I did want to point out, I think it's been 2 years that we've not raised the rate, because we did it once with Kenneth. We didn't raise it when he was there. And then Josh's first budget, I don't think we raised the rate. So I think it's been 2 years
Right,
we
I think
didn't.
we're actually 4 years into the plan, and we did it twice.
First 2
We didn't
years, and then the
do it
next 2 we didn't. Okay. A question, Ron talks about the fact that, we've decreased and we've conditioned people. And I guess my question is that we have this block spending. So we've spent the money to get the capacity, and we've conditioned people not to use the water. Even though we've restricted it to 2 days a week, some of them aren't taking even those 2 days. And so I guess my question is, the progressive rates that we've instituted, is it causing people not to use the water, which is limiting the revenue that we're bringing in as a result of putting in the capacity? So I think it's great. It's wonderful that we're getting people to stop using the water, but it's obviously hurting us in our ability to pay for the block spending that we've done to increase the capacity. So just something to think about. Is there a way for us to analyze this in such a way that take a look at the rates that we're charging, and if we were to adjust them somewhat, i.e. down a little bit, would people use more of it? We would generate more revenue. Don't know if that's the case or not. Don't know if we want to go there, but I think it's something that we should at least think about.
Well, that's why Ron Smith was pointing out that Marble Falls and them took off their restrictions, hoping people would use more water, and according to his, they didn't. So
But if
I don't
you
know
don't-
if our community would be any different or not. We don't know.
But if you can take the restriction off, but if you don't change the rate, that's what causes the people to stop doing it. They don't want to pay for the water, that much for the water. So while I was on council, I think there were 2 things that were the prime complaints that I got from people. Roads, everybody knows about that. But water was the number 2. They were pissed about how expensive it was getting for the water out here. And I went and took a look at other municipalities around us, and we were by far higher than the other ones that I looked at. And I guess my question is, what are we doing wrong out here that is causing us to be so much more expensive than others?
Very small raise.
And so why isn't the increase of the base helping that? We've increased dramatically over the last 5 years. We've added how many homes? Over 700 homes, and it hasn't helped solve the problem. Why? And I think we really should spend some time getting to the bottom of that. Why isn't that helping us solve the problem of our rates being dramatically higher than others? One thing that I think is super important, you asked about education, I think, David. Something to think about, I think a recommendation is that we want to get to the point where the part that we're subsidizing from our property taxes comes from the utility side of things. And I don't have a problem with that, but are we going to then lower our tax rate so we don't collect that money on the property tax side? If that's the case, we should let our citizens know that's the trade-off. We're going to charge you a little bit more for water, but we're going to lower your property tax rate because we don't need that much anymore because we're not subsidizing utility. That's something that you could use in the education process. You have to make the decision that you're going to do that, though,
Right.
that you are going to lower the tax rate if we're going to raise the utility rate. It doesn't seem like you should do both. Either keep taking the money out of property taxes and don't lower the rate, or pay for it out of water but lower the rate. And I think that's all I had. Thanks, appreciate it.
Yep. Anyone else in the audience? Council, any more questions?
I'm good.
So,
Excuse me, Mayor.
yes.
I would ask, when you looked at the rates around us, how much difference was there? How much difference was there between what we were doing?
30% that we were higher than some of the other municipalities that I looked at. It was
pretty Okay.
dramatic.
All right.
Mayor, a couple of things, if you have a minute. A lot of the things that we look at is not just the history of how the community was developed, but going back to what Mr. Smith said, you're looking at, it always goes back to per capita on a system. So the population matters, but it's also the amount of use on different segments of pipe in the ground. So we constantly talk about, we want to replace pipes and systems and pump stations and plants, but you've got to look at certain segments of town have low use on them. Pipes and streets have similar kind of useful lives in that if you're not using them, it can create as much damage as if you are using them. So high excessive use on a pipe can create issues, or extremely low use where things aren't moving through can create the same type of use, allowing roots or sediment or things to settle inside of a pipe. The struggle that we see, and I don't know what other rates in the region are, and we can look at those together, but per capita, we can't be compared to the larger growing utilities, but we could be compared to someone of similar size that has similar population and similar uses into our system. We know that we have older lines, but every city in the country has older lines that need to be replaced. We know that we have terrain issues that calls for increased project cost. So when we're putting new lines into the ground, what a main trunk line could cost one community that has sandy soils $1 million could cost us $2 million. So that all of a sudden kicks up our ability to not only do capital projects, but to do the maintenance on those projects. And then the need to pump and move wastewater and water to all the regions inside the community is also a huge difference. Wastewater being a pressure main system, compare us to another pressure main system. Don't compare us to a gravity flow system. Tons of communities in this country have gravity systems, and they don't have to pressurize the majority of their lines. That has more cost, that has more construction cost and treatment cost and other things that'll go into it. So, and I know Kevin's mentioned this before, the challenge is looking at an apples to apples. That's why instead of just doing a utility rate study, you do a cost of service study. And this is exactly what this city did a few years ago, and what we've done again here with Melissa is we look at what it cost us to treat and collect and to treat and distribute, and then spread that out over 4,000 customer accounts. And that's the only way that an enterprise fund can effectively work, is that the revenues support all of the expenditures. As we get more efficient in operations, which could be from doing engineering in-house, which could be from creating pipe that we can handle more easily, and having crews handle more construction jobs, potentially we lower our overall cost. And that's just that.
And if you don't mind, I'd like to tack on real quick on the comparison side. The other element is not only do we need to compare like utilities, and so that's both for water, that means you need to compare it to surface water systems who aren't subsidizing or don't have any other, we've got to compare the actual source of water. Groundwater is real cheap. Surface water is not so much. And then the size, the topography, the number, the mile of main per household, all of that. Equally, though, you also have to recognize revenue sources. So the examination is, are you comparing to anyone who has their entire infrastructure that was funded by a developer? What are their impact fees, and whether or not they're being subsidized by property taxes, and so you have to look at the whole picture, because just the water rates don't tell the entire story. That being said, to be very clear, this study did not look at an efficiency analysis that goes out and says how efficiently are you operating. And what my experience has been is utility rate comparisons don't tell us whether or not we're efficient. It just tells you whether or not you're high or low. But again, it doesn't compare anything in terms of the operations, because there's lots of things that were done 10, 15, 20 years ago that are completely outside of your control that's impacting your costs today. So, thank you. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Comments?
Format, Mayor, before you get other questions, format-wise, we wanted to have Melissa to give this presentation to council today, and then let council review the presentation, potentially send us any questions that we need to look at, or come back to Melissa to answer those questions. And then we want to bring this back to council, as we discussed during the budget workshops, to implement whatever change the council would implement for this current operating year. One of the things that we've talked about previously is our goal is for, if we have a rate increase, the goal would be to implement the rate increases effective July or January 1. So we'd start with the calendar year, and that would give us sufficient time to advertise information and then effectively change the rates and allow for people to be ready for any type of change for the year. But the easy way is, if we're going to change a rate, then we go through an ordinance and we advertise and we go through that process. So we have time for the council to consider, for community input, and for us to go back and look at the models and create any type of rate structure changes that the council would like to see.
I'd like, Melissa, do you do those kind of comparisons? Cities, groundwater service, you do?
Sure. Well, I can do a high level, this is the rates, but in terms of, it would take a lot of legwork to be able to, who's on groundwater, who's on surface water, what do they subsidize? Yeah, to get that. Yeah, I think most of the time, there's so many anomalies and variables to consider. Any rate-based comparisons are just not going to let you know if you're an efficient operation. I think that the better route, if you were concerned about that, would be to actually have someone come look at your operations and from an efficiency perspective. But I will say and point out, and we can give you the exact number, a lot of your costs are not operational costs, they're debt. And that's not something, operationally, your staff can change much about cost what it costs in the industry to install that infrastructure.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Anything else? Audience? All right, I'm going to call the work session adjourned at 5:05 PM.
We start back up at 6 o'clock.
We'll see y'all at 6.
I mean, the good news is the time.